Humans, we all begin at a single cell, and those cells divide and form the rest of our body. At some point in time, our bodies had a cell that could morph and develop into any part of our body once it's fully matured. Synthetic human embryos created in groundbreaking advance. What on earth are scientists up to? Hello, welcome to the Crossover Connections with Jack Wang podcast. I'm a scientist and a college professor at an Australian university. Scientists are making synthetic embryos. This kind of work exploits that part of technology to use a stem cell to make a more complicated organism. How complicated is the issue there, isn't it? If we could make a whole human and grow them in a test tube from a single cell, that is very scary. As a scientist, I find that quite scary to contemplate how we can regulate that. Having the ability and the responsibility, terrifying, even for scientists. But I think as you read on, that's not actually what's happening here. A living cell-based structure that resembles the beginnings of what an embryo could eventually look like. There's a lot of caveats there, isn't there? If this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then ultimately it might look something like a little bit of a facsimile of a full embryo. So we're still many, many stages away from growing full-fledged humans in a test tube. We're not there yet, and this article is not claiming that we're there yet, but really you can see the structures that are made from these stem cells do not have a beating heart or the beginnings of a brain, which is the main telltale sign of a cognitively aware living organism. But they do include cells that would go on to form the placenta, the yolk sac, and the embryo itself. So really the emergence and the beginnings of a structure that could eventually form an embryo, not a human. And what this particular professor from the University of Cambridge and Caltech, California Institute of Technology, said is that we can create human embryo-like models by reprogramming stem cells. And there's no near-term prospect of these embryos being used clinically because they're not embryos, first of all. But even if they were embryos, it's illegal to then implant them inside patients' wombs. The likelihood of an embryo surviving and growing in a test tube alone is very, very unlikely. Dolly the sheep, you may have heard of. Dolly the sheep is a cloned animal that only really worked when the embryo was then put into another mother's womb to carry that to full term. So we can't actually do all of this, to my understanding, completely in a test tube. Right now, we can grow cells, and we can grow cells that will eventually look like embryos. But really, growing embryos beyond 14 days, beyond 2 weeks is illegal. When we look at people who are pregnant and we want to understand more about the health of the baby and maybe why some mothers unfortunately have sick babies or they have some complications in their pregnancy. Usually the problem is not 14 days. Usually the problem is a little later on, a couple of months into their pregnancy. Right now, with this legal limit of examining embryos in the lab up to 14 days, that really compromises our ability to interpret what's going on with these kinds of pregnancy complications. Not to mention the embryos that are donated for research. That's a pretty small pool because it's very heavily regulated. A lot of this is illegal all across the world. The actual work has really been to say there are stem cells in mice. They can self-assemble into early embryo-like structures with the beginnings of a brain and a beating heart, but that's in mice, it's not in humans. And also these are not embryos that are technically defined to be embryos. They're just the beginnings of those embryos. The more interesting conversation is, well, if it actually turns into something that is a real life human, a real life embryo, can we trust this technology to anyone? To scientists, to governments, to regulators, to anyone? Can this type of breakthrough actually be trusted in this kind of framework? The fact that you're hearing about it right now is a really good sign that there is some common sense in this kind of work. The scientists are very aware of all of the triggers in society about human life and young babies, triggering concept for many, many people, understandably so. This kind of work has promise in terms of the good that it can do, but the scientists who are advancing this work have already self-nominated an ethical oversight process and a regulatory framework, both legally and morally and ethically. You may have heard of this kind of work a bit over the years in the news from 2021, where a series of Australian scientists, they were able to hack skin cells and turn them into cells that more resemble embryos. When we are conceived as humans, we begin as a single cell. And that cell has the potential to turn to any kind of cell in the body, skin cells, as well as brain cells and heart cells, all these kinds of cells. And these researchers in Monash University in Melbourne, they reprogrammed skin cells into 3D structures that look like the early stages of human embryos. In 2021, it was found that they really can't do much beyond resemble what embryos may look like eventually. They are not full embryos, a quasi-exciting discovery. It's not a true breakthrough in the true sense of it, but already it's triggering all of these ethical concerns and all of these regulatory frameworks that people are thinking about layering on top of the science and the science fiction that this might imply would happen throughout the world overnight. A recurring theme of the podcast is we want to de-escalate the excitement and fear around science and really communicate that science is exciting in a different way than you might imagine. Exciting because it is vulnerable to all the frailties of the human condition. The innovation very rarely is a eureka moment. Very rarely is it an overnight success. It is the product of constant heartbreaking rather than groundbreaking iteration. It is piece by piece of the puzzle, trial and error, try it against every direction, compete against every scientist in the world to make that incremental breakthrough. Cells are very vulnerable. And to get the cells into a form where they will become an embryo and they will become a human being is slow and very frustrating. So these are promising signs, but for it to become a fully fledged human, completely grown and developed by a scientist, Frankenstein or whatever other allegory you can think of in nightmarish children's fiction, we are nowhere near that. We are nowhere near that. It makes for a really catchy headline, the fact that we're able to change cells into another kind of cell that kind of more closely resembles a human embryo at some later stage of life, but we're not there. Cells are not actually fully functioning organisms. If it's a bacterial cell, then yes, one single cell for bacteria is enough for them to start making a population of bacteria and cause disease. But in multicellular organisms, you need all of these cells working together in different organs to really achieve consciousness and cognition and awareness and all of those things we typically associate with being human. I just want to de-escalate how scared you should be of this. You should be excited by the possibility, but also be aware that this is much slower than most of these headlines would like to tell you that it's happening at. You can find our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as Google Podcasts, as well as the full episodes are on the YouTube channel, Biolab Collective with Jack Wang. I'm Jack and hope to connect with you again next time around.